reflect on American society and on America's political system. The United States is a really interesting country to look at when you study politics. It calls itself the greatest democracy in the world, but honestly, it doesn't always live up to that. Looking at what we learned in class, I think America today is kind of a half finished version of a fair democracy. The big ideas are there, but real life often falls short. American culture is built around egoism, which is a fancy word for putting yourself first. We just call it individualism because that sounds better. The American dream is a really self focused idea. Work hard, take care of yourself, and you'll make it. People do nice things for others too, like donating money or volunteering, but the main story we tell ourselves is about looking out for yourself. This causes a free rider problem in things like public health, climate change, and even paying taxes, where everyone wants the perks but nobody wants to do their part. COVID was a great example. Wearing a mask and getting the shot were basically things you did to protect other people, but they got really political because they went against the me first way of thinking. You can also see the limits of empathy here, because Americans tend to care more about people who are like them, the in group, than people who aren't, the out group. That in group bias shows up in how we talk about immigration, poverty, and a lot of other stuff. On paper, the US is a representative democracy, the kind of system Locke wrote about. But in real life, it acts a lot more like a system run by a small group of powerful people. People love to say regular folks are too dumb to make big decisions, which is the complexity objection to direct democracy. But that excuse has been used way too much, and it ends up giving rich and well connected people way more control than they should have. Citizens United and the way money flows through politics is a perfect example of the corruption effect of power. Rich people use their money to get more access, and they use that access to make themselves even richer. The selection effect is also obvious. The kind of person who runs for office these days is usually someone willing to spend all their time raising money and saying whatever the donors want. Ranked voting could fix some of this by letting more parties run without messing up elections, and it works great in places like Maine and Alaska, but most of the country still hasn't tried it. The Constitution does a good job at negative rights, the kind of rights that say the government can do things to you. Stuff like free speech, religion, the right to gather, and not getting searched without a reason. These come from Locke's natural rights theory and from Kant's idea that people have their own minds and lives that should be respected. The problem is that positive rights, the kind that say that government should give you something, are really weak here. Most other countries treat healthcare, housing, and education as basic rights, but the US doesn't. That's because of the classical libertarian streak in how Americans think, where property rights, based on Locke's labor theory of property, are treated like they're untouchable, even when they get in the way of other people's basic needs. Rousseau had a different idea. He thought property rights should be civil rights, not natural rights, but that idea never really caught on here. What you end up with is a country where the fair value of rights is really uneven. Two people might both legally have free speech, but the guy who owns a TV station has way more actual speech than a homeless person on the street. So legal equality on paper doesn't mean much if people don't have the money or resources to actually use those rights. If you use Raw's idea of the original position in the veil of ignorance, American inequality looks really bad. The idea is, if you didn't know ahead of time whether you'd be born rich in Connecticut or poor in Mississippi, white or black, with health care or without, you probably wouldn't pick the system we have. The birth lottery in America has way too much control over how long you live, how much school you finish, how much money you make, and how much violence you see. That goes against Raw's difference principle, which says inequality is only okay if it actually helps the people at the bottom. The gap between the rich and the poor keeps growing, and people at the bottom aren't getting helped much by it. Racism and sexism still exist in America, even though the laws say everyone is equal. The civil rights laws got rid of the obvious stuff, but oppression keeps going in less obvious ways, like through old housing rules that still affect where people live today, wealth gaps that pile up over generations, the way bosses unconsciously favor certain people when hiring, and how cops sometimes treat people differently based on race. This is exactly why oppression keeps happening even when the laws are technically fair. The deeper stuff, like who has money and who doesn't change just because a law gets passed. Capitalism also pushes labor exploitation and treats people more like products than human beings, which makes everything worse. But America also has a really cool history of activism, from people fighting to end slavery, to women fighting to vote, to the civil rights movement, to today's movement like Black Lives Matter and people fighting for immigrants. Civil disobedience, like what Thoreau and Martin Luther King did, is still a really powerful tool when normal politics isn't working. The arguments for civil disobedience are especially strong when the system itself is rigged for the rich and powerful, because then breaking unjust laws becomes one of the only ways for regular people to be heard. So what needs to change? In my opinion, we need campaign finance reform so rich people don't run politics. We need to start treating things like healthcare and housing as real rights. We need to spread power out so it's not all in a few hands. We need ranked voting so we're not stuck with just two parties. And we need to be honest about the gap between what the law says and how things actually play out for regular people. America has the bones of a real democracy. It just hasn't actually finished building it yet.